welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into something important happening in museums and cultural spaces.
We're diving into this idea of reimagining the museum toward decolonized public spaces, which is based on Dora Wang's work.
Exactly. And it's all about understanding how museums are trying to, well, grapple with their own histories.
Right.
And become genuinely inclusive places for everyone.
It's quite a shift because, we often think of museums as these neutral spaces just holding history.
Right, just the facts.
But they actually have deep roots in colonialism. Thinkers like Foucault and Walensky, they've shown how museums historically shaped our understanding, often reinforcing a Western kind of authority.
Okay, so that leads us to the big question for today's deep dive. How can museums actually become these decolonial public spaces?
And Wang's work points to three main areas to watch.
Which are?
Well, first, how museums are challenging those dominant narratives, the old stories from the inside. Second, how they're collaborating with communities, sharing that authority. And third, the role of educators, how they use museums to get people thinking critically, engaging civically.
So it's a move away from museums just sort of telling us things.
Exactly. From just reproducing culture in one way towards becoming spaces for real dialogue, for justice, and maybe even transformation.
Okay, let's dig into the theory behind this. Wang uses some key thinkers, starting with Michel Foucault.
Yes, Foucault's ideas about power and knowledge are really central here.
How so?
Well, Foucault helps us see that museums aren't just passive displays. They actively construct our understanding of history.
Through what they choose to show.
Precisely. What they show, how they label it, what they don't show at all, shapes the narrative. It controls what's visible, what's considered true knowledge.
So for you listening, it means realizing that museum displays aren't neutral facts. They're curated interpretations.
Exactly. They're exercises of power, really.
That makes sense. Then there's Pierre Bourdieu, cultural capital.
Right.
How does that fit in?
Bourdieu's work helps us see how museums, maybe unintentionally, can reinforce social inequalities.
How does that work?
Think of cultural capital as knowing the sort of rules of the game for appreciating culture. Bourdieu argued museums often highlight the culture already valued by dominant groups.
Oh, okay.
So if your background aligns with that, you feel comfortable, like you belong. If it doesn't, you might feel excluded, even if the museum wants to be welcoming. It makes certain values seem normal.
So it's not just what's on the walls, but who feels that space is for them.
Interesting. What about Jürgen Habermas and the public sphere?
Habermas offers a more optimistic view, maybe. He saw the potential for places like museums to be true public spheres.
Meaning?
Meaning spaces for open dialogue where everyone can participate in making meaning together, not just experts dictating knowledge.
Right. So visitors become active participants.
Yeah, co-creators of understanding. It really pushes towards that idea of participatory knowledge.
I like that idea. A museum buzzing with different voices. And the last one, Paulo Freire, critical pedagogy. Freire connects learning directly to social change. He saw education, including in museums, as a tool to empower people.
Empower them how?
To question authority, to challenge dominant narratives, and importantly, to create their own counter-narratives. It's about using learning to work towards justice.
So that's where you get those real aha moments, understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. Seeing the implications beyond just the exhibit itself.
Okay, these theories give us a great framework. Now, tell us briefly about the research this deep dive is based on.
Sure. It draws from a review of 50 peer-reviewed articles and works published roughly between 2010 and 2025.
And the focus was?
Specifically on museum education, colonialism, and these decolonial approaches, using databases like Google Scholar, JS2R, that sort of thing.
Got it. And what's the historical context we need to keep in mind? You mentioned colonialism earlier.
Yeah, that history is absolutely fundamental. Museums, for the most part, emerged alongside imperial expansion. They were often set up to showcase Western culture as, well, superior, and non-Western cultures were often framed as primitive or exotic.
And how artifacts were acquired was often problematic too, right?
Deeply problematic, sometimes outright theft or collected under coercive conditions, and then displayed in ways that reinforce that whole civilized versus primitive binary. It taught a specific worldview.
A difficult history. And does that legacy still echo today?
It absolutely does. Even with good intentions towards inclusion, that historical weight is still there.
In what ways?
Well, think about whose stories get prioritized, the language used in labels, maybe who's represented on staff. These things can still create barriers, subtly reinforcing old hierarchies. The power dynamics haven't vanished just because the language changed a bit.
That context is so important for understanding why this reimagining is happening now. So let's talk about the actual practices. How are museums trying to decolonize?
Well, building on Habermas' idea, they're trying to become these active public spheres, places for empowerment, debate, co-creation of knowledge.
And the research points to specific strategies.
Yes, the literature highlights three main areas. Changes within the museum itself, institutional practices, how they work with communities, and partnerships with schools.
Okay, let's break those down. What's one key strategy?
A really big one is counter-narrative curation.
What does that involve?
It's about museums actively pushing back against those old, dominant, often colonial stories they used to tell. It means deliberately amplifying voices that were ignored or silenced.
Okay.
And doing it through engaging, maybe interactive exhibits that actually spark conversation.
Could you give an example?
Sure. Think of the Shelley exhibition in Glasgow. It centered LGBTQ plus culture and history experiences often left out of the main story.
Right.
Or Japan's National Hansen's Disease Museum, which focuses on the patient's own experiences, fighting stigma. It's their narrative. Another powerful one is Chile's Museum of Memory and Human Rights, remembering dictatorship victims, fostering healing by telling those difficult truths.
So it's about intentionally telling different, often marginalized stories.
Exactly, offering those alternative perspectives.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Another strategy you mentioned involves first-person narratives. How is that different?
It's about who tells the story. It's a direct shift in power. It's not just the museum talking about a community.
But the community speaking for itself.
Precisely. Including marginalized communities as co-curators, as the actual storytellers. That builds real ownership.
Like the National Museum of the American Indian.
That's a great example. Their three-label system includes not just curators, but also community voices, offering multiple perspectives right there on the label. And they often move away from strict timelines dictated by Western thought. Or look at Germany's Multaka project. They train refugees from Syria and Iraq to be museum guides in their own languages. They share their perspectives on the artifacts, connecting history to their lived experiences. It values that experience as expertise.
Giving people the platform for their own voice. Okay, what about the people actually working in the museum, like docents or educators? What's their role?
Oh, they're crucial. They're on the front lines, turning a passive visit into active critical thinking.
How do they do that?
Well, take that example of a rum bottle in a German museum. A traditional label might just give a date and origin.
Okay.
But a docent using a decolonizing approach might ask questions. What's the connection between this rum and colonialism and the slave trade? What does this object tell us about power and identity?
Prompting deeper reflection.
Exactly. Using maybe post-colonial terms, asking challenging questions. It turns looking at an object into a moment for reflection on difficult, complex histories.
So encouraging critical engagement, not just passive viewing. Now, artists' interventions, that sounds interesting. How do artists get involved?
Artists often come in as disruptors, you could say. They use their work to challenge the museum's own assumptions and narratives from within.
Can you give us a famous example?
Fred Wilson's 1993 project, The Museum, Mixed Metaphors, is a classic. He didn't add new things.
What did he do?
He rearranged the museum's own collection. He changed labels, put objects together in unexpected ways to reveal hidden biases.
Like what?
Famously, he placed iron slave shackles among displays of elegant 18th century silver and metalwork.
Wow.
It forces you to confront the link between that era's refinement and the brutality of slavery and colonial violence that supported it. It completely disrupts the comfortable narrative, makes you see the collection differently.
That's incredibly powerful, a real jolt to the system. Okay, moving beyond the museum walls, what about community participation?
This is fundamental. True decolonization means museums sharing power, co-creating knowledge with their communities.
So it's not the museum is the sole expert anymore.
No. It recognizes the community holds vital knowledge and experience. Members become storytellers, partners. Think about something like the Ideas City Festival. It turns urban spaces into platforms for community-led projects, blending art, activism, local knowledge.
Breaking down that traditional museum community barrier.
Absolutely. It's about genuine collaboration.
And in today's world, social media must play a role too.
Definitely. Digital platforms are changing the game in many ways. On one hand, museums are using them for things like crowdsourced curation.
Like Click, a crowd-curated exhibition.
Exactly. Involving the public directly, which challenges the old top-down model, but maybe even more importantly.
Yes.
Social media gives marginalized groups tools to create and share their own stories outside the museum walls entirely.
You mean like on TikTok or Instagram?
Yeah, platforms like Vine, TikTok. People are creating what some call digital archives. They challenge stereotypes, build community identity, preserve cultural practices. It's a form of digital expression, even resistance.
Creating their own spaces for representation. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Lastly, let's talk about teachers. What's their intervention?
Teachers are absolutely vital. They can bridge the gap between the museum visit and deeper learning in the classroom.
How?
By integrating museum experiences into the curriculum in a thoughtful way, exploring identity, history, culture critically. But it needs collaboration.
Between teachers and museum staff.
Yes. Teachers need support, museums need to understand classroom needs, and crucially, teachers need to do their own reflection, questioning their assumptions before leading these discussions.
Right.
The key is fostering dialogue, making students feel their perspectives matter. Using art projects, maybe even student-curated exhibits like the Storytelling Project, can be really effective for critical thinking.
So it's about making the museum visit part of a larger critical learning journey. Now, are there any pitfalls or limitations to be aware of in all this?
Well, yes. Power dynamics can still exist, even in collaborations between, say, teachers and museum staff. Who really holds the decision-making power?
That's a fair point.
And with social media, while it's empowering, we also have to be mindful of things like digital colonialism, the biases built into the platforms themselves, access issues, data ownership. It's not a perfect solution.
Important caveats. Okay, so to wrap up, what's the big conclusion here?
The main takeaway is that museums, historically, were often part of reinforcing colonial power structures, like Foucault and Bourdieu showed us. They centered certain narratives. Right.
So real decolonization isn't just tweaking exhibits. It requires a fundamental reimagining of the museum as a public sphere, like Habermas suggested.
Through these strategies we've discussed.
Exactly. Through things like counter-narratives, artist interventions like Fred Wilson's, deep community collaboration like Idea City, and critical pedagogy led by teachers, it's multifaceted.
It sounds like ongoing work.
It absolutely is. Walensky put it, well, we can't erase the past, but we can work towards a different future for these institutions. It takes continuous challenge, sharing authorship, centering dialogue. That's how they become truly just inclusive spaces for collective reimagining.
This has been incredibly insightful, a real deep dive into how museums are striving, sometimes struggling, to become truly public, decolonized spaces. It definitely gives you, our listeners, a lot to think about next time you visit a museum. Consider the stories being told, and maybe the ones that aren't.
And maybe think about this question. How can we, in our own communities, support this work? How can we encourage cultural institutions to continue this journey of decolonization? A great question to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.